Hello again. I talk a lot about doing volunteer projects, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. And if you've listened to me before, you'll know that's because, in my experience, you certainly get to give back to local communities in a way that you don't do with tourism. And in fact, through volunteering, you can give back directly to people who most need support, whereas money from tourism doesn't always find its way to the right people. And also in terms of just learning what's going on, it's a great way of getting a much deeper insight into other countries, other cultures. And from a wildlife perspective, often you'll get exclusive access to wildlife. So I definitely recommend to people to look at volunteering options as well as regular safari trips if you're going to somewhere like Africa or somewhere where there's where you want to see animals. However, there is a counter to that, and projects aren't always quite what they're sold as. And I've had a couple that have turned out that way. And I want to talk about one in Mozambique, and that's where I was when COVID lockdowns hit in March 2020. So it was kind of a difficult place. Probably not the best place to be when everything started heading south and flights were getting cancelled and all sorts of other things were going on. To be honest, that particular one, I wasn't enjoying anyway. Now, part of that is personal because I'd just come off 4 weeks at Victoria Falls, which was an absolutely amazing experience. And that was my favourite, my best project of all of the volunteering projects that I had done at that point. And probably, of all the volunteering I've done, I think Victoria Falls and Nakavango Conservation Program, if it isn't the best, it's definitely up there. And that was partly down to the way the program was constructed. It was animals I was interested in. The local people who were looking after us were extremely knowledgeable, had some fantastic experiences tracking animals. And also, a lot of the people I met there were just really great. And I think with every volunteering trip, you're probably going to find at least one person you don't get on with, unless you're one of those people who gets along with absolutely everybody. Even with the best will in the world, you're all there to learn, to do something new, to have an experience. But I usually find after a few days, the first few days, everyone's on best behaviour. And then you start to see what people are really like. And yeah, I'm not always the most tolerant of people. So I normally find somebody I don't like, and that's just the nature of it. But I don't think I'm alone in that. And in Victoria Falls, most of the people, as I say, I really got along with. In fact, some of them are friends now, 3 years later. And I'm still involved loosely and have some connections with that particular program. So there's an upside there. When I went to Mozambique, it was kind of the worst of the volunteering programs that I did. It wasn't a help that my bag got lost traveling from Victoria Falls down to Maputo, which is the capital of Mozambique. So that's down in the south. And when I flew in via Johannesburg. And when I got to Maputo, my bag wasn't there. And it took me quite a while to get that sorted out, by which time I had to be escorted to my flight to a place called Inhambane, which is, an hour-ish away from where I was actually staying. And it's one of those kind of 3-stop triangular routes. So I was on the the second stop. So we flew from Maputo somewhere else and then just stayed on board. And it was a small aircraft as well. And the people who are getting off, get off. People who are getting on, get on. And then you go again, one of those sorts of things. And when I got to Inhambane, the person who was supposed to be picking me up was late. So I was basically standing there, no bags, no one to pick me up, wondering what was happening next. So it wasn't the best start. And then and then at that particular time, we had all the chat about COVID happening as well, which was starting to become something that we were taking more or paying more attention to at that point. The lockdowns hadn't happened at that point, but it was suddenly becoming more than just a background conversation, which it had been while I was in Zimbabwe. And I guess to talk a bit more about that particular project, I don't think it was particularly well run. The person who was running it disappeared off for more than half the time I was there, and she wasn't there at the time that I left, albeit that we had to leave early in the end anyway. So that wasn't good. Some days I wasn't clear what I was supposed to do, so a lot of it was data entry. It was a different kind of project to what I would normally do. Although having said that, it was also missold, and that was pretty much the first thing that we were told when we got there, that it wasn't just about swimming with and photographing whale sharks, but there was an awful lot of other stuff that needed to be done, and they even admitted it had been missold, that the descriptions had been relevant a few years earlier, but certainly were not what was going on in 2020. So that's another negative, really, that when I got there, I mean, I'm pretty much open to do anything that I'm asked. I'm there to help, is the way I look at it, and to be a body and to use my skill sets to contribute to the project while I'm there. But it wasn't the best thing to hear, particularly with no bags and all the other sort of stuff. So, yeah, that one didn't have a brilliant start. And it was just one of those where I just found the people difficult to get on with. I even came back one day, I'd been down to the local market and found the front door to the house that we were in wide open. Nobody there at all. They just wandered off and left the door open. And of course, I've got thousands of dollars of camera gear there, thousands of photographs on hard drives, which, I was always careful to lock the house up when I left if I was the last one out. So I wasn't best pleased by that. So, yeah, you kind of, that is kind of a negative. So this is, as I say, I'm trying to give a sort of more balanced view of what can be a worst case scenario, hopefully, with volunteering, that you just end up with a bunch of people who, for whatever reasons, you don't get along with. And unfortunately, that's what happened with that particular group. So didn't enjoy that particularly, although I have to say I quite enjoyed being in Mozambique. It's difficult because it's one of the poorest countries in the world, and where we were based, which was a little place called Tofu, which is essentially a beach, lovely little area, the power would go off periodically. And in fact, we were in a house across the road from the office, and the lady who ran it would turn our Wi-Fi off when she left the office. So a couple of times we just go back in and turn it on again. But it was, I don't know, sort of silly stuff like that just became a bit irritating and a bit unwelcoming. So, and even, you got to appreciate, and I'm sure she would have known, that people who are volunteering would want to stay in touch with friends and family, tell them about what's going on, maybe post stuff on Instagram or whatever you do, or just have access to Wi-Fi in the off hours. And it was a bit strangely run that way. And the swimming pool that was in the brochure was completely empty, so there was no pool. And there was a sort of sloping path, sort of a 5-minute walk down to the beach. It was quite steep in places, and with loose sand on it, it was actually quite slippery. So, very interesting kind of place to be. I mean, I don't like to be negative about projects, but sometimes they're not all they're cracked up to be. And it's good if you can, I think, to maybe get feedback from people who've already done the trip, if it's one you're thinking of doing. And obviously that depends on a few things, because the staff at these projects turn over, people come and go from time to time. And as I say, it depends on the people you're with as well. You can be in a pretty awful project or badly run project, but if you're with a great group of people, you can have a lot of fun anyway. And equally, you can be in a very well-run project, but if you're with people who are just bad, you just don't get on with, that can be a problem too. So just things to be conscious of if you're thinking of doing that. The other thing that I'll mention while I think about it is, it was at the end of sort of 3.5 months in Southern Africa. And before I left Australia, which is where I'd been living, I was kind of thinking about whether or not to take antimalarials, because they are an antibiotic and they're fine to take for a relatively short period, say 2-3 weeks, that sort of thing. And bear in mind, I'm not giving you medical advice here. This is purely my experience. Once you start taking something like that for an extended period, it does have side effects, and it does affect your stomach, among other things. And I began to have trouble with my stomach, which meant I couldn't do some of the snorkel dives that I was supposed to do. So again, the main part of the project was to photograph and do photo ID of whale sharks, but you have to do that under the water. And the way to do that is to be a scuba diver. And I've done scuba diving in the past, but for me, just going out there for 2 weeks, it wasn't worth spending most of that time getting recertified in something I'm probably not going to use again, because I haven't scuba dived for a long time. So I took the snorkeling option, which my understanding before I went meant I could contribute. It turned out I couldn't really very much. And I'd even bought an underwater camera when I was in South Africa a few 2-3 months earlier. So again, it was misdescribed in some ways, and certainly what was there when I arrived was not what I was expecting. So that was a bit disappointing. But coming back to the antibiotics, and the antimalarials, I actually had to scrub a few dives because I just wasn't well enough to go, and I stopped using them. So, and speaking to people from Europe who spend long time periods in Africa, the school of thought seems to be don't take the pills, but obviously do what you can to prevent being bitten by mosquitoes in the first instance, and hopefully not be exposed to the disease. So it's something to think about if you are thinking about going to somewhere where there's malaria, or which would be the obvious one, where you would be taking regular medication. It's definitely worth having a chat to your doctor, your physician, about what the best thing to do is for you. As I say, I originally, talking to my regular doctor, I decided prevention was better than cure, and I decided not to bother with the pills, but then had dinner with another friend who is a doctor, and he was... Again, this comes back to schools of thought. So my regular doctor at the time was a little bit more, take a reasonable risk and it would be okay. Whereas some people are absolutely totally risk averse. And this is kind of more where this second doctor was sitting. And in the end, I bought antimalarials. I think it cost me about $500 because they weren't cheap, these things. So, or my medication anyway that I ended up buying was quite a lot. So you need to make that decision for yourself, but it's definitely worth getting advice on what the best thing to do is. When I'm away, I always wear long, very lightweight but full-length trousers, long-sleeve shirts, and use sunscreen with DEET in it to try and keep mosquitoes away from my hands, my neck, my head, anywhere that's exposed, basically, and go from there. So far, I've been lucky, but... as I say, it's a personal choice. So that's another thing to think about. So, this has been a little bit negative. I don't really like to do negative podcasts, but equally, I don't want to paint a kind of rosy picture of what goes on, which isn't realistic. So it's just something to be aware of. And certainly when I was at Nakavango, part of the briefing we had was simply that if there is someone you're not getting along with, make sure you're in a different vehicle, keep it away from each other as much as possible. And that way everyone has a nice time. And I think that's very good advice. Having said all of that, we did get to go to Inhambane, we're Tofu Beach, which is at the end of the government bus route. And the government bus the transport there is very, very cheap from a kind of Western wallet perspective. We got the bus, which was the start point pretty much to go into Inhambane. I think that was 40 minutes maybe. It was a reasonable kind of drive. Absolutely crammed with people, because we're going through the country routes, people coming on and off, and absolutely packed with people. And, it was good to see Inhambane and talk about the recent history of Mozambique. And it's been quite colourful. They have an AK-47 on their flag. And there's obviously a lot of history there, as there are in pretty much every country you go to. One story I will share, which was later in the trip. It was, I think, just before I was a day or two before I was planning to leave. I needed to go to the ATM. So the nearest ATM to us was not actually in the town of, the little town, Tofu. It's tiny little town, but there are a few. There's a hotel there. I think one or two guest houses. It's kind of like a little touristy place. With a bit, it's mostly there's a big market there, a few bars and things, that sort of thing. So not a bad place to be by any means, and a beautiful beach. So from there, though, the ATM that we were using was about a 10-minute drive away, and a little kind of shopping area. It's not even a mall, it's smaller than that. Just a little group of shops next to a petrol station on the road towards Inhambane. And the way a lot of people got around, rather than using the buses, which were I think maybe one an hour or something like that, it's not too regular. There are these little kind of minivans, the sort of thing you would sit maybe up to about 11 people in, depending on the size of the van, maybe a bit smaller than that. And they would just stop wherever you would give them, a tiny bit of money, and you just jumped off when you wanted to jump off. So I got one of these to go up to this ATM, and it was pretty packed with people anyway, and I couldn't sit down. So, and I can't remember how many people were in it when I got in, maybe 15 or 16 in a sort of 9-seater. So it was kind of cozy. And as we were driving along, we keep pulling over for people, and I was beginning to think, that you can't possibly squeeze anybody else in here because we're now so packed together. Anyway, we got to the ATM place, and I got out, and at that stage I was pretty sure I was engaged to this lady I'd been pressed up against for the last 5 minutes at least. So that was fun. And then, of course, having got my cash out, I had to get back again, and I was standing on the other side of the road to go back to Tofu, and there were a couple of younger guys just a little bit up the road from me, and I'm looking out for another little minivan coming in the direction I wanted. And I guess these guys were doing the same thing. Anyway, a guy in a ute, if you're Australian, you know what that is. If you're not, it's basically a little it's a car with a trailer thing, like a pickup, but a smaller one. So based on a car chassis rather than a lorry chassis, which is what the American pickup things are based on. So this ute pulled over, and these two lads jumped in, and as they went by me, they pulled over and they were beckoning me to join them. So I'd sort of asked in my really broken Portuguese, because my Portuguese is pretty much non-existent, and ended up just sitting in the tray at the back with these lads. And this guy was just pulling over, picking people up. I'd given him a few coins when I got in, and when we got into Tofu, the place where I wanted to be, I just sort of tapped on the cabin, banged on the cabin a couple of times, and he pulled over, and I just jumped out the back. So no health and safety, no seat belts, but quite a bit of fun really when you're used to being quite regulated as we are these days for all the right reasons. But it's quite fun to not follow the rules every now and again. So that was just a silly little thing. And one thing I will say about local traders, and given that at that time in early 2020, I think things were pretty bad anyway, in certainly the countries I was in, from a tourism perspective. It was quieter, people were short of money. That I was in poorer countries anyway, which makes things worse. And in the local market, if you even looked like you had cash, you would get absolutely swarmed by people selling you things. So I did in the end buy several pieces of artwork, which I gave away when I got to Europe. I got one piece myself, but others I'd bought for different people, and also some little name band things that go on the wrist there for my goddaughter's children. So they had those made up for them. But what I will say, because I think it's important, and a lot of certainly at least one person in the group I was with, having said what I've said about them already, just be honest with people. If you don't want something, just say it, but don't say things to put them off. Because this particular guy, this young lad, had said something about coming back, or he'll come back tomorrow, or whatever, and then didn't, because he had absolutely no intention of doing that. And one of the guy he'd said it to actually came round to our house looking for him because, the guy said he was going to turn up. He hadn't. So the chap had come to find him. And I think it's good to acknowledge that, because I find some people just say things without meaning it. And you have to understand that in certain cultures, and frankly, it's good manners anyway, but in certain cultures, if you say you're going to do something, the expectation is that you're going to do it. And I heard this story years ago about this English people visiting Greece, and they'd said to this family that I think they ran a taverna or something, and these people had been to the taverna every night or whatever it had been while they were there on holiday. And they'd said to these people, yeah, come visit us if you're in England. And of course, the Greek people did, and were not made very welcome by the English people, because they said what they said in the moment, but there was no real intention to honour it behind it. So I just say that because it's something I feel quite strongly about. If I say I'm going to do something, I do it. I just find being honest is an awful lot easier, because if you're not lying, you don't have to remember what lies you told. You can, and I'm not a bright boy. I can't remember what I said. So certainly if you're in places, do respect people. And this wasn't the case with this particular person who I was with in Mozambique. And, it reflects badly. The local people just don't trust you. And they're really nice people, and like everybody else, they're just trying to make a living. So it's nice to just treat people with respect. So that was what I wanted to say there. So otherwise, it was an interesting project from the perspective of being different. So I preferred wildlife because I can do my photograph animals, but I certainly got a different perspective, because one of the things they were looking at was microplastics, and what we would do is just mark out an area on the beach. We'd mark out a square meter, and then we would collect all of the plastic in the surface sand in that square, and just put it together in containers for the smaller stuff, and a bucket if there were bigger things. And once we'd done all of that, we'd also do a beach cleanup as well while we were walking about. We'd have bags with us and just clean up some of the rubbish, plastic bottles and things like that, beer cans, all the other things that would tend to get washed up or left by people just being lazy. So we do a cleanup, and then we'd go back to the office and spread everything out on paper, measure it, and then put a report back in. And that went back to, I can't remember exactly where it went to now, so apologise for that. But we had to do a count of the different categories of plastics. So microplastics are fragments, very small piece of plastic that have eroded off or broken off something, and how many of those. Then the bigger sizes, and everything was kind of graded. So you would count the different types of different sizes you had. We'd make a note of colours, and in fact photograph the samples. Each group we do a photograph as well. And one of the things they were doing with the project was just to photograph things like bottle caps that would hit the beach and just post them. So there's an aspect of naming and shaming the manufacturers, with the hope that they would kind of get behind encouraging people to just, put rubbish away somewhere sensible, not just throw it anywhere. Because, of course, one of the big problems is that microplastics particularly have found their way into the food chain. We eat it ourselves. We're at the top of the food chain, mostly. But because these very small pieces of plastic, as they're being eaten by fish, they're eaten by other things. We eat the fish, we eat the other things that eat the fish. All of that gets into our food. And this is why having these ocean cleanups, it's not just about making the ocean look a lot better, not killing animals that would eat things like jellyfish and mistake plastic bags for jellyfish and then can't feed because this plastic has lined their stomach and they can't take food in anymore. It's actually to help ourselves, and this is the thing with climate change as well. It's not about saving the planet, because the planet will find a way, but it's about saving us, because we're gradually destroying the environment that we need to survive. So I won't go too far down that path, but it was a different kind of volunteer work that I was doing than I had done in other projects. So another thing they were doing there was taking observations at different times of year of different animals. So the whale sharks, obviously, they're raised. They're trying to arrange to get them to be protected by the Mozambique government. And that's also a bit of a trade-off with some of these countries, because to make it illegal to hunt them, I mean, first of all, you've got to enforce it, but also sometimes with these governments, there's quite a good trade in allowing these animals to be hunted offshore because they can build an industry around it. So it all comes down to money, unfortunately, or most of the time it comes down to money. And it's quite difficult making a case to stop that happening, or at least push the government to start putting in legislation to make it illegal to hunt the beautiful animals. You know, the big rays are absolutely amazing. So it was rays as well as sharks. And one of the things we would do, so the days where I was kind of left on my own with no particular brief about what I was supposed to be doing, I'd just go out and do surveys around the town and have my volunteer t-shirt on and just be asking visitors why they'd come along. And it was to try and put together a database or make a case for the government to say, look, basically people have come here to see the whale sharks. They want to go and scuba dive with them. They want to go out in boat trips and see them. So if most of the visitors who come here have come to see the whale shark, doesn't it make sense to protect them? Because that way you're protecting that industry, that hospitality industry, because obviously then you're supporting hotels, bars, everything else that comes together in that package. So it was an interesting trip to finish on. It wasn't, as I say, when I arrived, it wasn't quite the project I understood I was on. But again, it's just a case of making the best of it. And the microplastics was definitely interesting. And in fact, a few months earlier, while I was still in Australia, there had been a call for volunteers, so citizen scientists, to actually do a project in Antarctica. And that involved, I think, a month's training in South America before we then went to Antarctica for a month. So I believe the schedule they were looking at. And part of that was to look at microplastics in Antarctica. So unfortunately, I wasn't successful in applying for that. But it is something that I think is often overlooked. And even some of this plastic, it biodegrades, but biodegrades to what? If it biodegrades to microplastics, it's really not helpful. You're much better off with a plastic bag that you can pick up and dispose of properly than having a plastic bag that dissolves into, millions of pieces of microplastic that just get into the food chain and does all sorts of damage. So that aspect is one that I think I've seen it a few times spoken about, but it's one that doesn't tend to make headlines, but it's just as important. So I guess on that note, from the perspective of, well, what can I do? Well, just be conscious of what plastic you're using. Think about packaging in particular. So when I do shopping, I have reusable bags. I don't use plastic bags. And certainly in some countries, some states and countries, plastic bags are no longer available. Things like toilet rolls. I order toilet rolls from a place that just packs them in paper. Or when I get them from the supermarket in Sydney, I would just only buy tended to be individual rolls that were wrapped in paper, but they weren't wrapped in plastic. So I've stopped using as much plastic as I can. Toothbrushes, I use bamboo toothbrushes now. Toothpaste. Those toothpaste tubes, think of how many of those are just going straight into landfill if there are alternatives to using toothpaste. So just have a think. I'm not going to get onto a crusade about it, but there are definitely things you can do just day to day. And when you're at the supermarket, if you're buying food, look at buy the stuff that's not in plastic. If you can avoid anything that's not organic, use something that is wrapped in something organic so that you're not adding to the problem. And again, it comes back to that old adage, you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And that's where individually we can each make a difference. So that's it. I'll stop talking about all of that, but it's kind of a bit of a ramble, but I thought that, I just wanted to share a little bit of the background, perhaps talk about a project that didn't go as well as I would have hoped. Let's put it that way. So a bit of a disappointment in the end. And that's the reality of it. So again, the tips really are to find out what you can before you go. If you can, connect with anyone who's previously been on the trip, because then you get the sort of first-hand experience and feedback, and also tips on what to take. Sometimes for local schools and children, it's good to take books, exercise books. Sanitary pads is another one that it can be helpful to take. So just have a chat if you can, and definitely the project coordinator should know if you're going to a project. They will give you advice on what things you can throw into a little bit of extra sort of spare space in your luggage, and bring something that's of huge value to the local people. Okay, that's it. I'm going to stop now. So I hope, as I say, that's been useful, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.